Dr. Owen Fletcher would never forget the first time he saw the Vance sisters. It was not their age that struck him, nor the wild white hair that fell in tangled masses past their shoulders, nor even the deep lines that carved their faces like ancient riverbeds cutting through stone. It was their eyes. Pale grey eyes so penetrating, so unnaturally intense that meeting their gaze felt like being examined from the inside out. Eyes that seemed to see not just through you, but into the hidden chambers where you kept your secrets, your fears, your sins. Eyes that had witnessed decades of suffering and carried the weight of knowledge no one else possessed. He encountered them on a narrow mountain trail 3 miles outside Hazard on October 19th, 1903. Fletcher had been walking since dawn, following directions given by a nervous shopkeeper in town who refused to accompany him. The sisters stood perfectly still beside an enormous oak tree, identical in every way. Same height, same posture, same long grey dresses that might have been fashionable 40 years earlier. And those eyes fixed on him with an intensity that made his medical training feel suddenly inadequate. They did not speak. They simply watched as he approached, and when he passed them on the narrow trail, he felt their gaze following him like a physical touch on the back of his neck. He turned to look back, and they were gone, vanished into the forest without a sound, as if they had never been there at all. But he could still feel those eyes burning in his memory. This was not how Fletcher had imagined his first week in Kentucky would unfold. And before we descend into the dark hollow where the Vance sisters kept their most disturbing secrets, if you are drawn to these forgotten corners of American history, the cases that were buried, the mysteries that were deliberately erased, the stories they did not want told, you need to subscribe to Appalachian Shadows right now. Because every week, I bring you a case like this from the heart of the Appalachian Mountains. Something real in spirit, something disturbing. Something that challenges what you thought you knew about justice, about medicine, about the price of keeping secrets in isolated mountain communities. And this is one of the most morally complex and deeply unsettling cases I have ever investigated. Dr. Owen Fletcher had arrived in Perry County, Kentucky, with the best intentions and the worst timing. He was 28 years old, fresh from his medical training at the University of Pennsylvania, filled with progressive ideas about public health and sanitation. He had read about the Appalachian region in medical journals, about the poverty, the lack of proper health care, the preventable diseases that ravaged isolated communities. He wanted to help. He wanted to make a difference. The town of Hazard in 1903 was a rough place, built on coal and timber, with a population that swelled and shrank depending on the mining operations. The main street was unpaved, turned to thick mud whenever it rained. The buildings were mostly wood, hastily constructed, functional rather than beautiful. There was one hotel, 3 saloons, a general store, and a small church that served multiple denominations because there were not enough people to support separate congregations. Fletcher rented a room above the general store and immediately began offering his services. The previous doctor, an elderly man named Silas Braxton, had died the previous winter, leaving the community without medical care for nearly 8 months. The need was desperate. Fletcher saw patients with infections that should have been treated weeks earlier, children with nutritional deficiencies, miners with lung diseases from breathing coal dust for years. But it was a conversation with the store owner, a man named Caleb Morton, that first brought the disappearances to Fletcher's attention. They were sitting in the back room of the store on Fletcher's 3rd evening in town, sharing a bottle of whiskey, when Morton mentioned it casually, as if discussing the weather. "You will want to be careful if you travel up toward Blackberry Ridge," Morton said, pouring another glass. "Men have a way of not coming back from up there." Fletcher leaned forward with interest. "What do you mean?" "Accidents?" Morton shifted uncomfortably, glancing toward the door, as if worried someone might overhear. "Maybe, maybe not. All I know is that over the past 30 years, maybe more, men who go up that way sometimes just vanish. Miners mostly, sometimes travelers, occasionally a local who knows better but goes anyway." "How many men are we talking about?" Fletcher asked, his medical mind already cataloging this as potential data, a pattern that might have an explanation. "Hard to say for certain," Morton replied. "Nobody keeps official count. But I have been running this store for 15 years, and in that time, I would say at least 12 men that I knew personally. And I hear stories about more from before my time. Some folks say 40 or 50 over the years." Fletcher felt a chill despite the warmth of the whiskey. 40 or 50. "And no one has investigated?" Morton laughed bitterly. "Investigated? Doctor, you are not in Philadelphia anymore. This is the mountains. Men die here all the time. Cave-ins in the mines, falls from cliffs, drownings in the river when it floods, bear attacks, simple starvation when winter comes hard. The county sheriff is one man trying to cover territory that takes 3 days to cross on horseback. And most of the disappearances? They are men who do not have families asking questions. Drifters, workers who move from mine to mine, men running from something in their past." "But you said there is a specific area," Fletcher pressed. "Blackberry Ridge. Why there?" Morton's face grew even more serious. He leaned in close, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. "Because that is where the Vance sisters live." Fletcher waited, sensing there was more. "Prudence and Patience Vance," Morton continued. "Twins, must be in their 70s now, maybe older. They have lived up there in a cabin on the ridge for as long as anyone can remember. Lived there with their father until he died, 25 years back. After that, just the two of them, alone up there. And people think they are responsible for the disappearances?" Fletcher asked, his skepticism evident. "People think a lot of things," Morton said carefully. "Some call them witches. Some say they are healers, that they know old mountain medicine passed down from the Cherokee. Some say they are just crazy old women who should be left alone. But the fact remains, Doctor, men go up that ridge, and they do not come back. And those sisters? They never come down to town, never buy supplies, never need anything from the outside world. How do you explain that? 2 old women surviving alone in the mountains for decades without ever needing help?" Fletcher did not have an answer, but his scientific mind immediately began forming hypotheses. Perhaps the sisters traded with other isolated families in the mountains. Perhaps they grew and preserved their own food. Perhaps they were simply remarkably self-sufficient. There had to be a rational explanation, but Morton was not finished. "There is something else," he said. "About 10 years ago, Sheriff Wendell Tucker decided to ride up there and check on them, see if they were all right, see if maybe they knew anything about the missing men. He took 2 deputies with him. And?" Fletcher prompted when Morton paused. He came back white as a sheet, would not talk about what he saw, but he told everyone in town to stay away from that cabin, that the Vance sisters were not to be disturbed under any circumstances. He died 3 years later, never spoke of it again. But before he died, he told the new sheriff, a man named Raymond Collier, to leave them be. Said some things are better left alone in these mountains. Fletcher sat back, processing this information. Every instinct he had, every principle of his medical and scientific training, told him there had to be a logical explanation. Mass hysteria, superstition, coincidence elevated to causation. But there was also a pattern here, and patterns demanded investigation. "I would like to visit these sisters," Fletcher said finally. "Not to accuse them of anything, but to offer medical services. If they are elderly women living alone, they might need health care. And perhaps I can learn something about these disappearances." Morton's face went pale. "Dr. Fletcher, I would strongly advise against that. Whatever is happening up on Blackberry Ridge, it has been happening for a long time. You are new here. You do not understand how things work in these mountains." "Then help me understand," Fletcher replied. "Give me directions to their cabin. I will go in daylight, I will be respectful, and I will simply offer my services as a physician. If they refuse, I will leave. But I cannot practice medicine in good conscience, knowing there are people in my coverage area who might need help." Morton tried several more times to dissuade him, but Fletcher was determined. Finally, reluctantly, the store owner drew a rough map on a piece of paper, marking the trails that led up Blackberry Ridge. He also insisted Fletcher take a rifle, which Fletcher accepted, though he had never been comfortable with firearms. "If you do go," Morton said as Fletcher prepared to leave, "do not go alone. And whatever you do, Doctor, do not look them directly in the eyes for too long. People who have seen them say their eyes are not right, not natural, like they can see things they should not be able to see. Fletcher dismissed this as more superstition. But the next morning, as he set out on the trail with his medical bag and the borrowed rifle, he found himself thinking about those words. And when he encountered the sisters on that narrow path, when he finally met that penetrating grey gaze, he understood exactly what Morton had meant. Those eyes were not natural. They looked at you and saw everything. Fletcher reached the cabin 2 hours after his encounter with the sisters on the trail. It sat in a small clearing on the eastern face of Blackberry Ridge, surrounded by dense forest on 3 sides and overlooking a steep ravine on the 4th. The structure was old but well maintained, built from logs that had darkened with age. Smoke rose from the chimney. Chickens scratched in a small yard. There was a vegetable garden, though most of the plants had been harvested for the season. He approached slowly, calling out a greeting so as not to startle anyone. The cabin door opened before he was halfway across the clearing, and there they stood. Prudence and Patience Vance side by side, watching him with those intense grey eyes. Up close, their faces told a story of hard mountain living. Deep lines radiated from the corners of their eyes and mouths. Their skin had the weathered quality of people who spent decades exposed to sun and wind. Their hands, visible beneath the sleeves of their dresses, were gnarled and scarred. But it was still their eyes that dominated everything else. Pale grey, almost silver in certain light, set deep beneath heavy brows and fixed on him with unwavering focus. "Good morning," Fletcher said, stopping a respectful distance from the porch. "My name is Dr. Owen Fletcher. I'm the new physician in Hazard, and I'm visiting families in the area to offer medical services." Neither sister spoke. They simply stood there, identical, unmoving, watching. Fletcher tried again. "I understand you have lived here for many years without coming to town. I wanted to make sure you are both in good health and to let you know that if you ever need medical attention, I am available to help." Still nothing. The silence stretched uncomfortably. Fletcher was about to turn and leave when finally one of the sisters spoke. Her voice was surprisingly strong for her age, clear and precise, with an accent that spoke of education rather than the rough mountain dialect he had heard from most locals. "We do not need your help, Dr. Fletcher. We take care of ourselves." "I am sure you do," Fletcher replied. "But even the healthiest people occasionally need medical care. A broken bone, an infection, an illness. I simply want you to know that I'm here if you need me." The other sister spoke now, her voice identical to her twins. "Why are you really here, Doctor? Who sent you?" Fletcher was taken aback by the directness of the question. "No one sent me. I came of my own accord because I am the physician for this area, and you are residents of this area." The sisters exchanged a glance, some unspoken communication passing between them. Then the first one spoke again. "People in town have been telling you stories?" "About disappearances." "About us?" It was not a question, but Fletcher answered anyway. "Yes, they mentioned that some men have gone missing over the years in this area, but I did not come here to accuse you of anything. I came to offer medical help. And if we refuse your help?" The second sister asked. "Then I will leave and not bother you again," Fletcher said honestly. "But I would ask if you know anything about the disappearances. As a physician, I am concerned about any pattern of deaths or injuries in the community." Another long silence. Then, unexpectedly, the first sister smiled. It was not a warm smile, but it was not hostile either. It was the smile of someone who has decided something, made a choice that cannot be unmade. "Come inside, Dr. Fletcher," she said. "We will talk." Wait, think about this for a second. Two elderly women, completely isolated, living for decades, without apparent contact with the outside world, and they speak with educated accents and show no fear of a stranger with a rifle. They immediately know he has heard stories about them, as if they can read his mind. Drop a comment right now with your theory, because these details, they are going to matter at the end, and I want to see if anyone figures it out before we get there. The interior of the cabin was surprisingly well appointed. There were shelves lined with books, more books than Fletcher had seen in most mountain homes. Medical texts, botanical guides, works of philosophy and literature. A large table dominated the center of the room, its surface covered with dried herbs hanging from the ceiling, jars filled with various substances, and notebooks stacked neatly in one corner. Fletcher noticed immediately that this was not the home of ignorant mountain women. This was a workspace, a laboratory of sorts. The sisters moved with practiced efficiency, one gesturing for him to sit, while the other prepared tea from a kettle on the wood stove. "I am Prudence," said the first sister, settling into a chair across from him. "This is Patience. We are aware of what people say about us in town, Dr. Fletcher. We have been aware for many years." "Then perhaps you can help me separate truth from superstition," Fletcher said carefully. Patience brought the tea, pouring 3 cups with steady hands. "What do you wish to know?" "The disappearances," Fletcher said directly. "Men who came to this area and never returned. Do you know anything about them?" The sisters exchanged another glance. Those penetrating eyes seemed to be weighing him, measuring something invisible, deciding how much truth he could handle. "Yes," Prudence said finally. "We know about them. We know because we tried to save them." Fletcher leaned forward, his heart racing. "Save them? From what?" "From the poison," Patience said simply. "From the contamination that has been killing men in these mountains for 30 years. And with those words, everything Fletcher thought he understood about this case began to crumble. The sisters explained in alternating sentences, their voices blending together as if they were one person speaking through 2 mouths. Their father, they said, had been a mining engineer from Virginia, educated at a technical college, who came to Kentucky in the 1860s to work for one of the major coal companies. Their mother had been a school teacher. Both sisters were educated at home, learning medicine, botany, chemistry, and literature from their extensive library. When their father was 50 years old, he discovered something that would eventually cost him his life. The mining company he worked for, a massive operation called Consolidated Kentucky Mining, was disposing of toxic waste from their processing operations by dumping it into abandoned mine shafts that connected to underground water sources. The contamination was slow but deadly, poisoning groundwater that fed springs and streams throughout the region. "Father tried to report it," Prudence said, her grey eyes fixed on Fletcher. "He went to the company owners in Lexington. He provided documentation, water samples, maps showing the contamination spread. They thanked him for his diligence and told him they would investigate. 3 weeks later," Patience continued, "he became ill. Terrible stomach pains, vomiting, weakness. He died within a month. The company doctor ruled it natural causes, heart failure. But we knew better," Prudence added. "We had learned enough from Father to recognize poisoning when we saw it. They killed him to silence him." Fletcher listened with growing horror. "Why did you not go to the authorities?" The sisters both smiled sadly. "We were women, Doctor. We were in our 40s, unmarried, living alone after our father's death. Who would believe us? The mining company employed half the county. They owned the sheriff, the judge, the newspaper. We had no proof that would stand up in any court. So instead," Patience said, "we decided to save who we could." She rose and walked to a cabinet, removing a thick leather-bound journal. She placed it on the table in front of Fletcher and opened it. The pages were filled with neat handwriting, dates, names, symptoms, treatments. "For 30 years," Prudence explained, "we have been watching. When men start showing signs of the poisoning, we try to get them here, to treat them, to save their lives. The symptoms start subtly," Patience added. "Fatigue, headaches, nausea. Then they progress. Tremors, confusion, bleeding from the gums. By the time most men realize something is seriously wrong, the contamination has done permanent damage." Fletcher's hands trembled as he turned the pages of the journal. There were dozens of names, maybe hundreds. Detailed notes on symptoms, treatments, attempted outcomes. And as he read, his medical training allowed him to see the pattern. These were classic signs of heavy metal poisoning, likely arsenic or mercury compounds used in ore processing. "How do you get them here?" he asked. "Sometimes they come on their own," Prudence said. "They hear rumors of mountain healers, old women who know medicine. Sometimes we find them collapsed on the trails. Sometimes we go to the mining camps and offer to treat workers who are ill. The company does not like that, Patience added darkly. They prefer their workers die quietly, preferably after they have left employment and gone elsewhere. Fletcher looked up from the journal. You said you tried to save them. That implies you were not always successful. The sisters' faces grew even more somber. Those penetrating grey eyes seemed to dim slightly, burdened with some terrible weight. No, Prudence whispered. We were not always successful. The revelation should have been a relief. These were not murderous witches, but heroic women fighting a corrupt corporation. But something in the way the sisters said those last words, something in the sudden shadow that crossed their faces, told Fletcher there was more to this story, something darker that they had not yet shared. And he was right to be worried, because what waited in the cave behind the cabin would prove that sometimes the road to hell truly is paved with good intentions. The sun was setting by the time Fletcher prepared to leave. The sisters had invited him to return, to bring any patients he encountered with suspicious symptoms to work together to document the contamination. Fletcher agreed eagerly, his mind already composing the letter he would write to state health authorities in Frankfurt. But as he walked toward the door, Patience stopped him with a hand on his arm. Her grip was surprisingly strong for a woman her age. Dr. Fletcher, she said, those pale grey eyes boring into his. Before you go, there is something you should see, something we show to no one, but if we are to work together, you must understand the full scope of what we are dealing with. Fletcher nodded, though something in her tone made his stomach tighten with apprehension. The sisters led him outside, past the cabin, into the forest. They walked for perhaps 10 minutes as twilight deepened around them. Finally, they stopped before what appeared to be a natural rock formation, a jumble of boulders at the base of a cliff. Prudence produced a lantern from somewhere, lit it, and then squeezed between two massive rocks. Fletcher followed, his medical bag catching on the stone, forcing him to turn sideways. Behind him, Patience brought up the rear, carrying a second lantern. They emerged into a cave, not large, but tall enough to stand upright. The lantern light revealed a space perhaps 20 feet across, with a ceiling that disappeared into darkness above. And covering every available surface, arranged with meticulous care, were personal belongings, clothing folded and stacked, boots lined up against one wall, pocket watches, wallets, knives, tools, photographs in tin frames, letters tied with string, everything labeled with paper tags, names and dates written in the same careful handwriting from the journal. Fletcher turned slowly, taking it all in. There must have been belongings from 50 men, maybe more. And in the center of the cave, illuminated by the lantern light, was a table covered with medical instruments. Surgical knives, bone saws, bottles of various liquids, and stacks of blood-stained cloth. What is this? Fletcher breathed, though he already feared he knew the answer. This is where we keep them, Prudence said quietly. The ones we could not save. The ones who died here despite everything we tried. And the ones we had to keep from going back, Patience added, her voice barely above a whisper. Fletcher felt cold sweat break out across his forehead. What do you mean, had to keep from going back? The sisters looked at each other, and in the flickering lantern light their ancient faces seemed to carry the weight of centuries. When they looked back at him, those penetrating grey eyes were filled with something Fletcher had not seen before. Not wisdom, not determination, but guilt. Deep, abiding, crushing guilt. Some of them survived the poisoning, Prudence said, but the damage to their minds was too severe. They could not remember who they were, could not speak coherently, could not care for themselves. We kept them here, Patience continued. Fed them, cleaned them, tried to restore their minds, but they never recovered. They lived for months, sometimes years, trapped in bodies that no longer worked properly. And when they finally died, Prudence said, tears now visible on her weathered cheeks. We kept their belongings, to remember them, to remind ourselves of every single person we failed. Fletcher staggered backward, his mind reeling. This was not a heroic tale of women fighting corruption. This was a nightmare of good intentions twisted into something monstrous. The sisters had been keeping poisoned men prisoner in this cave, keeping them alive in vegetative states, unable to release them because they could not be allowed to return to the mining camps, where they would either die anyway or reveal the sisters' activities to the company. How many? He asked, his voice shaking. How many men have you kept here? The sisters did not answer immediately. They simply stood there in the lantern light, two ancient women with penetrating eyes that had seen too much suffering, too much death, too much of the impossible choices that come from fighting an enemy with infinite resources. Finally, Patience spoke. The belongings you see represent 43 men over 30 years. 14 died quickly from the poisoning, beyond our ability to help. 29 died slowly, some in days, some in months, some in years. Their minds destroyed by the toxins, even as we kept their bodies alive. And the others? Fletcher whispered. You said men have been disappearing, more than 43. Prudence's eyes seemed to glow in the lantern light, that penetrating gaze cutting through every defense Fletcher had. The others died before they reached us. Their bodies are scattered throughout these mountains. The company men make sure of that. Anyone who starts asking questions, anyone who seems to be connecting the contamination to the deaths, they disappear. Accidents in the mines, falls from cliffs, drownings. The company has been protecting its interests for 3 decades, Dr. Fletcher, and we have been fighting a losing battle ever since Father died. The magnitude of it struck Fletcher like a physical blow. This was not just a medical crisis. It was a conspiracy of corporate murder spanning 30 years, with dozens of victims, and these 2 old women at the center trying desperately to save lives, while simultaneously committing terrible acts in the name of mercy. And he, Dr. Owen Fletcher, was now a part of it. He knew too much. He had seen too much. The only question was what he would do with that knowledge. As they walked back to the cabin in darkness, Fletcher's mind raced through possibilities. He could go to the authorities, but the sisters were right. The mining company owned everything and everyone. He could write to state officials, but he had no proof beyond the word of 2 old women and their personal journals. He could confront the company directly, but he would almost certainly end up as another disappearance statistic. Or he could do what the Vance sisters had been doing for 30 years. He could fight in the shadows, save who he could, document everything, and wait for the day when someone with power might finally listen. When they reached the cabin, Prudence and Patience stood on the porch, watching him with those unnervingly penetrating eyes. What will you do, Dr. Fletcher? Prudence asked. Will you help us? Patience added. Or will you try to expose us and accomplish nothing except alerting the company that their secret is no longer safe? Fletcher looked at these 2 women, these twisted saviors, these merciful killers, these walking contradictions. And he made the choice that would define the rest of his life and ultimately lead to his own destruction. I will help you, he said, but we are going to do this differently. No more prisoners. If they cannot be saved, we let them go. We document everything, every case, every death, every piece of evidence. And we find someone, somewhere, who has the power to shut this company down. The sisters smiled, identical expressions of relief mixed with sadness. We were hoping you would say that, Prudence said. Though we fear, Patience added, you do not yet understand what you are agreeing to, what it will cost you, what it will take from you. And those penetrating grey eyes, ancient and knowing, seemed to see directly into Fletcher's future, into the darkness that awaited him on Blackberry Ridge. Dr. Fletcher returned to Hazard. In darkness, his mind churning with everything he had learned, he went directly to his room above the general store, bypassing the saloon where miners gathered after their shifts. He needed time to think, to process, to decide his next move, but sleep would not come. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw those penetrating grey eyes staring back at him, seeing through him, judging him. He spent the night writing, 2 letters actually. The first was to the Kentucky State Board of Health in Frankfort, detailing his suspicions about industrial contamination in Perry County. He kept it vague, mentioning symptoms he had observed, without naming the Vance sisters or revealing their cave. The second letter was to a former professor at the University of Pennsylvania, Dr. Martin Ashworth, a man who had made his reputation exposing unsafe working conditions in Pennsylvania coal mines. If anyone would believe his story and have the connections to do something about it, it would be Ashworth. He mailed both letters the next morning and then waited. Weeks passed. The autumn deepened into early winter. Fletcher established his medical practice, treating miners for routine ailments, delivering babies, setting broken bones. And twice a week, he rode up to Blackberry Ridge to work with the Vance sisters. What he learned during those visits both fascinated and horrified him. The sisters had taught themselves an impressive amount of medical knowledge through their father's books and decades of practical experience. They could identify dozens of toxic plants and their antidotes. They understood basic surgery, though their techniques were often brutal by modern standards. They had developed treatments for metal poisoning that actually worked, using combinations of herbs that bound to the toxins and helped flush them from the body. But they had also developed other practices, darker methods born from desperation and isolation. When Fletcher examined their medical instruments, he found tools that had clearly been used for procedures no legitimate physician would attempt. When he pressed them for details, they finally admitted the full truth. Some of the poisoned men they had kept alive in the cave had suffered so terribly, had begged so desperately for death, that the sisters had eventually given them what they asked for. Mercy killings, they called them. Quick doses of concentrated nightshade extract that stopped the heart within minutes. Painless, peaceful, a release from agony. How many? Fletcher asked, his voice hollow. Prudence met his gaze with those intense grey eyes. 7, over 30 years. 7 men who we kept alive too long, who suffered too much, who finally convinced us that death was kinder than what we were doing to them. Fletcher felt sick. These were not just healers. They were executioners, arbiters of life and death, playing God in a cave in the Kentucky mountains. But as he looked at their faces, at the deep lines of suffering carved there, at eyes that held 3 decades of impossible choices, he could not find it in himself to condemn them entirely. No more, he said firmly. From now on, if someone cannot be saved, we make them comfortable and we let nature take its course. But we do not actively end their lives. Do you understand? The sisters nodded slowly. We stopped years ago, Patience said quietly. After the 7th. We swore we would never do it again. But those 7 still haunt us every single day. Their eyes, Prudence whispered. In our dreams we see their eyes. Grateful eyes, relieved eyes, eyes that thanked us for ending their suffering. But eyes that also accused us, that asked us why we let them suffer so long in the first place. Fletcher spent November and December documenting cases. He found 6 men working in various mines around Hazard who showed early symptoms of metal poisoning. He convinced them to let him take blood samples, urine samples, detailed medical histories. He examined the water sources near the mines, collecting samples in glass bottles that he sent to the sisters for analysis using their rudimentary but effective chemical tests. The pattern was undeniable. Every man who showed symptoms had been working in mines operated by Consolidated Kentucky Mining. Every contaminated water source could be traced back to drainage from those same operations. The company was systematically poisoning its workers and the surrounding environment. But documenting the problem and proving corporate responsibility were 2 different things. Fletcher needed to establish direct causation to show that the company knew about the contamination and chose to do nothing. He needed access to company records, internal memos, engineering reports, and that meant he needed an ally inside the company itself. The opportunity came in late December. Fletcher was treating a mine foreman named Thomas Brennan for a broken arm, setting the bone in the small clinic he had established in the back room of the general store. Brennan was in his 50s, a company man through and through, loyal to Consolidated Kentucky Mining for 30 years. But he was also clearly troubled, drinking more than he should, sleeping poorly based on the dark circles under his eyes. "Something on your mind, Mr. Brennan?" Fletcher asked as he wrapped the splint. Brennan looked at him for a long moment, those work-hardened eyes measuring, deciding. "You have been asking questions, Doc, about men getting sick, about water quality." Fletcher's heart rate increased, but he kept his voice steady. "I am a physician. It is my job to understand health patterns in the community." "That is what I figured," Brennan said. "And I figure you ought to know something. Something I have kept quiet about for 5 years, but it has been eating at me." Fletcher pulled up a chair and sat down, giving Brennan his full attention. The foreman explained that in 1898, an engineer from the main office in Lexington had come to Perry County to inspect the waste disposal operations. The engineer, a young man fresh from college, had been horrified by what he found. Tons of mercury, arsenic, and lead compounds from ore processing being dumped directly into abandoned mine shafts, with no containment, no monitoring, no safety protocols whatsoever. The engineer had written a report recommending immediate cessation of the dumping and costly remediation of the contaminated areas. He had estimated it would cost the company over $100,000 to clean up the existing contamination and implement proper waste disposal. "What happened to the report?" Fletcher asked, though he already suspected the answer. "Company buried it," Brennan said bitterly. "They transferred the engineer to a mine in West Virginia, isolated him where he could not make noise. Then they told us foreman that if we breathed a word about waste disposal to anyone, we would be fired and blacklisted from every mine in Kentucky. A man cannot feed his family if he cannot work, Doc, so we kept quiet. Do you know where that report is now?" Brennan shook his head. "Main office, I suppose, or destroyed. But I remember what it said. Every word. I've got a good memory when it comes to things that bother my conscience." Fletcher leaned forward. "Would you be willing to write down what you remember? Date it, sign it, make it a formal statement?" Brennan's face went pale. "Are you asking me to commit professional suicide, Doc?" "I am asking you to save lives," Fletcher replied. "And I am asking if you can keep living with the weight of what you know." The foreman was silent for a long time. Finally, he nodded slowly. "I will do it, but you got to promise me something. My name does not go public until you got enough evidence that the company cannot just bury this and come after me. Can you promise that?" "I promise," Fletcher said, knowing he was making a commitment he might not be able to keep. "And if this investigation is drawing you in so far, tap that like button. It genuinely helps Appalachian Shadows bring more of these forgotten cases to light. These stories from the mountains deserve to be told." Brennan wrote his statement over the next week, meeting Fletcher in secret locations around Hazard. 6 pages of detailed information about waste disposal practices, estimates of contamination levels, names of other foremen and workers who also knew but stayed silent. It was damning evidence. But Fletcher knew it still was not enough to bring down a company the size of Consolidated Kentucky Mining. He needed the original engineering report. And to get that, he would have to do something dangerous. In January of 1904, Fletcher made a trip to Lexington, using money he had saved from his medical practice. He told people in Hazard he was attending a medical conference, which was partially true. There was a conference and he did attend some lectures. But his real purpose was to visit the main office of Consolidated Kentucky Mining. He had rehearsed his cover story carefully. He was a physician conducting a public health survey of mining communities, looking at worker health outcomes, industrial safety practices, environmental factors affecting well-being. He had official-looking documents prepared, letterhead from the State Board of Health that he had borrowed from a colleague, a questionnaire with impressively technical medical terminology. The company receptionist was skeptical, but agreed to let him speak with someone from the engineering department. Fletcher was led to a small office where a middle-aged man named Harold Perkins greeted him with professional courtesy but obvious wariness. Fletcher launched into his prepared speech, discussing worker health, statistical analysis, comparative studies across different mining operations. He made it all sound legitimate, technical, boring. He asked to see any engineering reports related to waste disposal and water quality, claiming he needed to understand the technical specifications to properly assess health outcomes. Perkins hesitated, clearly suspicious. "Most of that information is proprietary, Dr. Fletcher. I cannot simply hand over company documents to outside researchers." Fletcher had anticipated this. "I understand completely. I'm not asking to take anything with me. I simply need to review the materials here, take some notes for my statistical models. You could supervise the entire time. I assure you, I have no interest in company secrets, only in public health data." The appeal to supervision seemed to ease Perkins's concerns. He left the office and returned 15 minutes later with a stack of folders. "These are the water quality and waste disposal reports from our Perry County operations for the past decade. You have 1 hour, and I will be sitting right here while you review them." Fletcher's hands trembled slightly as he opened the first folder, but he forced himself to remain calm, to move slowly through the documents, as if he were simply gathering boring statistical information. And there in the third folder he found it. The 1898 report from the young engineer, complete with detailed diagrams showing contamination spread, chemical analysis of water samples, and cost estimates for remediation. But more importantly, there were internal memos attached to the report. Memos from company executives discussing the findings. And in one memo dated October 12, 1898, a vice president named Edmund Thatcher had written words that made Fletcher's blood run cold. "The cost of remediation exceeds acceptable expenditure levels. Recommend continued current disposal practices. Worker attrition from health complications remains within acceptable parameters and is offset by readily available replacement labor. Long-term environmental concerns are not relevant to current profitability projections. Worker attrition, acceptable parameters, not relevant to profitability." The company had known they were killing their workers. They had calculated the cost of human lives against the cost of cleanup, and they had chosen profit. Fletcher's hands shook as he copied the memo word for word into his notebook, trying to keep his handwriting steady so Perkins would not notice his distress. He copied dates, names, figures. He sketched the contamination diagrams. He gathered enough information that, combined with Brennan's statement and the Vance sisters' medical records, might actually be sufficient to force an investigation. When his hour was up, he thanked Perkins politely and left, walking as calmly as he could manage until he was outside the building. Then he practically ran to the train station, terrified that someone would realize what he had seen, what he had copied, what he now knew. The train ride back to Hazard took 6 hours. Fletcher spent the entire time organizing his notes, cross-referencing information, building the case in his mind. He had the evidence. He had the documentation. He had witnesses. Now he just needed to get this information to someone who had the power and the will to act on it. He did not know that his visit to the Lexington office had already been noted, that Harold Perkins, despite his apparent cooperation, had immediately reported the physician's unusual interest in waste disposal reports to his superiors, that even now, as Fletcher's train rattled through the Kentucky hills, decisions were being made in corporate offices about how to handle this new problem. The company had been protecting its interests for 30 years. They had dealt with troublesome engineers, nosy journalists, concerned physicians. They knew how to make problems disappear, and Dr. Owen Fletcher had just become their newest problem. Fletcher arrived back in Hazard on a frigid January evening, the temperature well below freezing, the sky threatening snow. He went directly to his room, intending to immediately write up a comprehensive report, combining all his evidence. But when he unlocked his door, he knew something was wrong. The room had been searched. Professionally, carefully, with items returned almost to their original positions. But Fletcher had the medical habit of noticing details, and he could see the subtle signs. His desk drawer was closed slightly differently. His medical bag had been moved 2 inches to the left. The papers on his desk were stacked in a different order. His heart pounding, he checked his hiding places. The notes from the Vance sisters were still under the loose floorboard beneath his bed, but the board had been lifted recently. He could see fresh scratches in the wood. Thomas Brennan's signed statement was still tucked inside a hollowed-out medical textbook on his shelf, but the book had definitely been opened and examined. They knew, the company knew he was investigating them, and they had sent someone to find out how much he had discovered. Fletcher grabbed his most important documents, stuffing them into his medical bag. He needed to get this evidence somewhere safe, somewhere the company could not reach it. He thought immediately of the Vance sisters. Their cabin was remote, isolated. If he could hide the documents there, they would be secure. But as he turned to leave, there was a knock at his door. Fletcher froze. In 1904, in isolated Hazard, Kentucky, no one came calling after dark unless it was an emergency. And this did not feel like a medical emergency. "Dr. Fletcher?" A man's voice, polite but firm. "This is Sheriff Collier. I need to speak with you." Fletcher opened the door slowly. Sheriff Raymond Collier stood in the hallway, and behind him were 2 men Fletcher did not recognize. Big men, dressed in city clothes rather than mountain wear. Company men. "Evening, Sheriff," Fletcher said, keeping his voice steady. "Is something wrong?" "That is what I am here to determine," Collier replied. "These gentlemen are from Consolidated Kentucky Mining. They have some concerns about your recent activities. I think it would be best if we all had a conversation." Fletcher's mind raced. He could refuse, claim they had no right to question him. But that would only make them more suspicious. Better to appear cooperative, to act as if he had nothing to hide. "Of course," he said. "Please come in." The 5 of them crowded into the small room. Collier looked uncomfortable, clearly not happy about being used as muscle by the mining company. The 2 company men, however, looked perfectly at ease. They had done this before. The taller of the 2 men spoke first. His name was Robert Gardner, and he introduced himself as head of security for Consolidated Kentucky Mining. "Dr. Fletcher, we understand you recently visited our main office in Lexington, requesting to review confidential company documents." "I was conducting research for a public health survey," Fletcher replied. "I reviewed documents with full supervision and approval." "Indeed," Gardner said. "But we have also heard that you have been visiting a certain property on Blackberry Ridge, the home of Prudence and Patience Vance, 2 women who have made serious and unfounded accusations against our company in the past." Fletcher felt a chill that had nothing to do with the January cold. "I visit many properties in this area as part of my medical practice. The Vance sisters are elderly residents who occasionally need health care." "And what about this?" The second company man, who had not introduced himself, pulled a piece of paper from his coat. It was a copy of the letter Fletcher had sent to the State Board of Health in Frankfurt. Fletcher's stomach dropped. They had intercepted his correspondence. The company's reach was even greater than he had imagined. "That is simply a routine report on health conditions in the county," Fletcher said, though he knew it sounded weak. Gardner smiled coldly. "Dr. Fletcher, let us be direct with each other. We know you have been investigating our operations. We know you have been talking to our workers. We know you have been collecting water samples and spreading concerns about contamination. If there is contamination, do you not think the community has a right to know?" Fletcher asked, his temper flaring despite his fear. "There is no contamination," Gardner said flatly. "There are only rumors spread by bitter old women and ambitious young doctors looking to make names for themselves. And we cannot allow those false rumors to damage the company's reputation and harm the economic well-being of this entire region. Be honest with me in the comments. If you were Dr. Fletcher, would you have backed down at this point to protect yourself? Or would you have continued fighting even knowing the danger? Because I have thought about this a lot while researching this case, and I am still not sure there was a right answer." Fletcher looked at Sheriff Collier, hoping for some sign of support, but the sheriff's face was carefully neutral. The message was clear. The law in Perry County served the mining company, not the truth. "What exactly are you asking me to do?" Fletcher said finally. "We are asking you to focus on your medical practice," Gardner replied. "Treat injuries, deliver babies, set broken bones. Stop making wild accusations. Stop bothering our workers with questions. Stop visiting troublemakers like the Vance sisters. And most importantly, stop trying to damage a company that provides employment and economic stability to this entire community." "And if I refuse?" The unintroduced company man spoke for the first time, his voice soft but menacing. "Then you will find it very difficult to practice medicine anywhere in Kentucky. We have relationships with hospitals, medical boards, licensing authorities. A few well-placed questions about your competence, your ethics, perhaps even your sanity, and your career will be finished before you turn 30. Not to mention," Gardner added, "that accidents happen in these mountains. People fall from cliffs. They get lost in caves. They encounter dangerous animals. It would be tragic if a promising young physician suffered such a fate simply because he could not mind his own business." The threat was unmistakable. Back off or be destroyed, professionally or literally. Fletcher looked at these men, at their cold eyes that saw human beings as acceptable losses in profit calculations. And he made his choice. "I understand," he said quietly. "I will focus on my medical practice." Gardner smiled. "Excellent. I'm glad we could reach an understanding." He stood, the second man following his lead. "Sheriff, thank you for your cooperation. Dr. Fletcher, we will be watching to ensure you keep your word." After they left, Collier lingered for a moment. He looked at Fletcher with something that might have been sympathy or might have been disappointment. "I served under Sheriff Tucker," Collier said quietly. "The man who visited the Vance sisters 10 years ago. He told me once, right before he died, that the worst thing he ever did as a lawman was choose to look away from something he knew was wrong because fighting it would cost him everything." "Is that advice?" Fletcher asked. "That is a warning," Collier replied. "Tucker looked away and it ate at him until the day he died. But he was still alive to die of natural causes. The people who did not look away, most of them are not around anymore to regret their choices." The sheriff left, closing the door softly behind him. Fletcher sat alone in his room, his hands shaking, his mind torn between survival instinct and moral obligation. He had told Gardner he would back off, but he had not meant it. He could not mean it. He had seen too much, knew too much. Those penetrating gray eyes of the Vance sisters had shown him a truth he could not unsee. He would continue the investigation, but he would have to be more careful, more secretive, more prepared for the consequences. He spent the rest of that night writing a detailed account of everything he had learned, every piece of evidence he had gathered. He made 3 copies, hiding them in different locations. One under the floorboard, one sealed in a jar buried in the woods behind the store, one he would take to the Vance sisters in the morning. If the company killed him, at least someone would know the truth. At least the evidence would survive. But as he finally lay down to sleep, as the first light of dawn crept through his window, Fletcher did not yet understand the real danger he faced. He thought the threat came from company thugs, from professional enforcers who would make his death look like an accident. He did not realize that the greatest danger came from the impossible situation he had helped create, from 2 old women whose penetrating eyes had guided them through 3 decades of terrible choices, from the men still hidden in the cave, the ones the company would kill if they were ever discovered, from the weight of secrets that no one could carry forever, and from the simple fact that sometimes when you fight monsters, you have to become something monstrous yourself. The snow that had been threatening all night finally began to fall. Heavy, wet flakes that would soon cover the mountains in white, burying the landscape under a blanket of cold silence. And somewhere on Blackberry Ridge, in a cabin surrounded by winter forest, 2 elderly sisters stood at their window, watching the snow fall with those ancient, penetrating eyes. They knew Fletcher would come. They knew he would not back down despite the warnings. And they knew what that meant for all of them. The endgame was approaching. The 30-year war between the Vance sisters and Consolidated Kentucky Mining was about to reach its bloody, inevitable conclusion. And Dr. Owen Fletcher, the idealistic young physician who thought he could save everyone, was about to learn the true cost of fighting for justice in a world where the powerful write all the rules. Because what he would discover in the cave over the next 2 weeks, what the sisters would finally reveal about the men they still kept hidden, would force him to make a choice that would define not just his life, but his very soul. And those penetrating gray eyes would watch him make that choice, judge him for it, and know, long before he did, whether he would survive what was coming. Fletcher rode up to Blackberry Ridge the morning after the company's visit, his medical bag containing not just instruments and medicines, but the carefully documented evidence he had gathered. The snow had stopped, leaving the world transformed into something beautiful and treacherous. The trail was slippery, dangerous, and Fletcher had to dismount and lead his horse for much of the climb. When he reached the cabin, the sisters were waiting on the porch, as if they had known he would come. Those penetrating gray eyes fixed on him before he was even across the clearing, reading his face, understanding immediately that something had changed. "They came for you," Prudence said. It was not a question. "Last night," Fletcher confirmed. "The company knows I have been investigating them. They threaten to destroy my career or worse if I do not stop." "And will you stop?" Patience asked, though those ancient eyes already knew the answer. "No," Fletcher said simply, "I cannot." The sisters exchanged one of their wordless glances, and something passed between them, some decision made in the span of a heartbeat. Then they stepped aside, gesturing him into the cabin. "Then you need to see everything," Prudence said. "All of it, not just the belongings in the cave, not just the records, everything." Fletcher followed them inside, a sense of dread building in his chest. He had thought he understood the full scope of their operation, but clearly there were still secrets they had kept from him. The sisters led him to the back of the cabin, to a door he had noticed before, but never seen opened. Prudence produced a key from a chain around her neck and unlocked it. Beyond was a narrow staircase leading down into darkness. "This connects to the cave system," Patience explained as she lit a lantern. "But there are chambers we have not shown you. Chambers where we keep the ones who are still alive." Fletcher's blood went cold. "Still alive? You said all the men you kept died years ago." "We said the ones we showed you had died," Prudence corrected. "But there are others. 3 men who have been with us for years. One for 7 years, one for 12, one for 15. Fletcher staggered, gripping the doorframe for support. 15 years? You have kept a man prisoner for 15 years. "Not prisoner," Patience said softly, those penetrating eyes full of pain. "Patient. He was 26 when he came to us, poisoned nearly to death by mercury exposure. We saved his body, but his mind was destroyed. He cannot speak, cannot recognize faces, cannot feed himself. We have kept him alive, kept him clean, kept him as comfortable as we can. But he is not truly living. He has not been for a very long time." They descended the stairs, entering a section of the cave system Fletcher had never seen. The passage was narrow, forcing them to walk single file, the lantern light casting wild shadows on the stone walls. After perhaps 50 yards, they emerged into a chamber that had clearly been modified extensively. There were wooden supports reinforcing the ceiling, a small stove for heat, beds carved into alcoves in the rock. And there in those alcoves were 3 men. The first was the one Patience had mentioned, the man kept alive for 15 years. He lay on his bed, eyes open but empty, staring at nothing. His hair was gray, despite what Fletcher estimated was no more than 40 years of age. His body was thin, muscles atrophied from lack of use. But he was clean, dressed in simple clothes, and appeared to have been recently fed. A wooden bowl with remnants of broth sat beside the bed. The second man was in better condition, at least physically. He sat propped against the cave wall, rocking slightly, humming a tuneless melody. When Fletcher approached, the man looked at him, and Fletcher saw intelligence in those eyes, but fractured, scattered, unable to fully connect with reality. The third man was the most disturbing. He was mobile, walking in circles around his small area, talking constantly in a low voice. But the words were nonsense, fragments of memory jumbled together. The poisoning had not destroyed his mind so much as scrambled it beyond any hope of repair. Fletcher moved from man to man, his physician's training taking over despite his horror. He checked pulses, examined pupils, tested reflexes. These men were alive, but they were trapped in bodies that no longer housed functional minds. They would never recover. They would exist like this until they died, which could be years or even decades if the sisters continued caring for them. "Why?" Fletcher asked, his voice raw. "Why keep them like this? Why not let them go?" "Let them go where?" Prudence asked, and the anguish in her voice was terrible to hear. "Back to the mining camps, where the company would interrogate them about where they have been. Even in their broken states, they might reveal something about us, about this place. The company would kill them to tie up loose ends, and then they would come for us. Or we could abandon them to die," Patience added, tears now streaming down her weathered cheeks. "We could stop feeding them, stop caring for them, let exposure and starvation take them. But we cannot. We have kept them alive this long. We are responsible for their continued existence. To withdraw care now would be murder. But keeping them like this is torture," Fletcher said, gesturing at the three men. "This is not mercy. This is not healing. This is preserving suffering." "We know," Prudence whispered. "We have known for years. And it is destroying us, Dr. Fletcher. Look at us, really look." Fletcher turned and truly examined the Vance sisters in the lantern light. He had noticed their eyes before, those penetrating grey eyes that seemed to see everything. But now he looked deeper and saw what lay beneath. The eyes were not just intense, they were haunted, desperate, carrying a burden of guilt and impossible choices that had ground away at them for 3 decades. Their hands trembled constantly, not from age, but from the strain of years of impossible caregiving. Their faces, beyond the natural weathering of mountain life, showed the deep lines of chronic anguish. These were women being slowly destroyed by their own compassion, unable to kill, unable to abandon, unable to save, trapped in a hell of their own making. "The poisoning," Fletcher said slowly, understanding dawning. "Your father's book said metal poisoning could be passed through touch, through long-term exposure to contaminated materials. You have been treating poisoned men for 30 years, handling their clothes, their waste, their bodies. You are contaminated too." Patience nodded. "It is in our blood now, Doctor. In our bones. We feel it some days, the tremors, the pains, the confusion that comes and goes. We are dying slowly, just like all the others. The only difference is we know what is killing us. And our eyes," Prudence added. "You mentioned how penetrating they are, how intense. That is one of the symptoms, Doctor. The mercury compounds affect the nervous system, including the optic nerves. Our vision has changed. Colors are more vivid. We can see in dimmer light than we should be able to. But we also see things that are not there sometimes, shadows at the edge of vision, movements that vanish when we turn to look." Fletcher felt sick. The Vance sisters were not mysterious mountain healers with uncanny abilities. They were poisoning. Victims themselves, suffering from the same contamination they had spent 3 decades trying to combat. Those penetrating eyes that seemed to see too much were actually damaged eyes, organs failing slowly under toxic assault. "How long?" he asked. "How long do you have?" The sisters looked at each other. Another of those wordless communications. "A year, maybe 2, Prudence said. "Our father lasted 5 years after his symptoms became obvious. We have been showing symptoms for 3 years now. The tremors, the visual disturbances, the periods of confusion. It is accelerating." "What happens to these men when you die?" Fletcher asked, gesturing at the 3 patients. "They die too," Patience said simply. "There is no one else who knows they are here, no one else who could or would care for them. When we are gone, they will starve in the darkness." The full horror of the situation crashed over Fletcher. The Vance's sisters had created a system that could only end in tragedy. When they died, their patients would die. The evidence of the company's crimes would be lost. 30 years of fighting would amount to nothing, and the company would continue poisoning workers, calculating acceptable attrition rates, valuing profit over human life, unless someone stopped them. Unless someone took the evidence Fletcher had gathered and the testimony the sisters could provide and forced the world to pay attention. "We need to expose this publicly," Fletcher said, "not just to state authorities, but to newspapers, to federal officials, to people who cannot be bought or intimidated by the company. We need to make this so public that the company cannot bury it." "And what about them?" Prudence asked, pointing at the three men. "The moment we go public, the moment the company knows we are serious about exposing them, they will come for us. They will destroy the evidence. They will kill these men to eliminate witnesses. Then we move them first," Fletcher said, his mind racing through possibilities. "We get them somewhere safe, somewhere the company cannot reach them, and we move. All the evidence, all your records, all the documentation. We scatter it so thoroughly that destroying one piece does not destroy everything." It was Patience who asked the question Fletcher had been dreading. "And who will care for these men while we are fighting the company? Who has the knowledge, the time, the commitment to keep them alive?" Fletcher looked at the three men, at their empty eyes and broken minds, and knew the answer. He was the only one. He was a physician. He had the skills, and he had made a choice to help the Vance sisters, which meant accepting responsibility for everything that choice entailed. "I will," he said quietly. "I will care for them." Over the next 2 weeks they planned. Fletcher made secret trips to the cave, learning the sisters' routines for caring for the three men. He practiced the feeding techniques, the cleaning methods, the medication schedules. The sisters taught him which herbs to use for pain management, which compounds helped reduce tremors, which treatments seemed to slow the progression of the poisoning. And they compiled everything, every journal entry from 30 years, every piece of evidence from the cave, every water sample, every medical record, every artifact that proved what had happened in these mountains. They made copies of the most crucial documents, hiding them in multiple locations throughout the cave system. Fletcher also continued gathering his own evidence. He convinced more miners to provide anonymous statements about health problems. He collected additional water samples from streams near the mines. He documented case after case of men showing poisoning symptoms. And he wrote to Dr. Ashworth in Pennsylvania, this time sending the letter through a friend in Lexington who could mail it without local postal workers seeing it. But they all knew time was running short. The company was watching. Fletcher saw the same two men who had visited his room, now stationed in Hazard, ostensibly as mine safety inspectors, but actually as watchers, making sure he kept his word about stopping his investigation. And the sisters were deteriorating. Their tremors worsened. Their periods of confusion became more frequent. One morning, Fletcher arrived to find Prudence sitting at the cabin table, staring at her hands, unable to remember why she had come into the room. The episodes passed, clarity returning, but the message was clear. They did not have much time. The break came in late February. Dr. Ashworth replied to Fletcher's letter, and his response was everything Fletcher had hoped for. Ashworth had connections with investigative journalists at several major newspapers. He knew federal inspectors who could not be bought by mining companies. Most importantly, he believed Fletcher's account and was willing to help expose the scandal. But, Ashworth wrote, "I need witnesses who will testify publicly. I need physical evidence that can be independently verified. I need enough documentation that the story is undeniable, even in the face of corporate pressure. Can you provide this?" Fletcher showed the letter to the Vance sisters. "This is our chance. We bring Dr. Ashworth here, show him everything, give him copies of all your records. He takes the story to newspapers in Pittsburgh, Philadelphia, New York. places where the company's influence is limited. We make this a national scandal. They will kill us, Prudence said calmly. The moment the story breaks, the company will send men to eliminate everyone involved. Then we disappear, Fletcher replied. We take the 3 men, we go somewhere the company cannot find us, and we wait until the story has spread too far to suppress. By the time anyone knows where we are, there will be too many people watching for the company to act openly. It was a desperate plan, full of holes and risks, but it was also the only plan they had. They set a date, March 15th, 1904. Dr. Ashworth would arrive in Hazard, claiming to be visiting Fletcher for medical consultation. Fletcher would bring him to the cave, show him everything, provide him with copies of all the evidence. Ashworth would return to Pennsylvania and begin publishing the exposé. Meanwhile, Fletcher, the Vance sisters, and the 3 patients would leave Kentucky, traveling to a remote property patients remembered in West Virginia, a place where their mother's family had once lived. They would hide there until it was safe to return, or until they received word that the company had been shut down. It was not a good plan, but it was the best they could manage. March 14th arrived. Fletcher made his final preparations, packing everything he would need for an extended absence, settling his affairs in Hazard. He told people he was taking a few weeks to visit family in Pennsylvania. Nothing suspicious, nothing that would alert the company watchers. That night, he rode up to Blackberry Ridge one last time before the plan would begin. The sisters were waiting, but something was wrong. Fletcher could see it immediately in their faces, in the way those penetrating eyes avoided his gaze. "What happened?" he asked. Prudence spoke, her voice hollow. "Thomas Brennan is dead. The foreman who gave you the statement about company waste disposal. They found his body this morning at the bottom of a mine shaft. The company is calling it an accidental fall." Fletcher felt his stomach drop. Brennan had been careful, had told no one but Fletcher about his statement, but somehow the company had learned of his cooperation, and they had eliminated him. "They know," Fletcher said. "They know we are planning something." "There is more," Patience added. "Sheriff Collier came here this afternoon, rode all the way up the ridge to warn us. He said company men have been asking about Dr. Ashworth, about whether anyone from Pennsylvania is planning to visit. They have spies at the train station, at the hotels. They are waiting for him. The plan was compromised before it even began. If Ashworth came to Hazard, he would be identified immediately, possibly killed before he ever reached the cave. And if Fletcher tried to flee with the sisters and the patients, the company would track them down before they reached safety." They sat in the cabin as darkness fell. 3 people who had fought so hard for so long, now facing the reality that they might have already lost. It was Prudence who finally spoke, those damaged, penetrating eyes fixed on Fletcher with terrible clarity. "There is only one way to ensure the truth comes out. One way to make sure the company cannot bury this forever." Fletcher waited, dreading what she would say. "We burn it all down," Prudence said. "The company mine operations in Perry County, we destroy them. Make it impossible to continue business as usual. Force an investigation that is too big to ignore." "That is sabotage," Fletcher said. "That is terrorism. People could be killed." "People are being killed," Patience countered, "every day, slowly by poison. Brennan is dead. Your career is being destroyed. We are dying. Those 3 men in the cave have lost everything that made them human. How many more have to suffer before violent action becomes justified?" Fletcher looked at these 2 women, these twisted angels who had started with pure intentions and been corrupted by impossible circumstances into something darker. He saw in their penetrating eyes not madness, but clarity. The terrible clarity that comes from 3 decades of fighting an enemy that plays by no rules and recognizes no limits. And he realized they were right. Nothing else would work. Letters to authorities had been intercepted. Witnesses were being killed. Evidence was being suppressed. The only way to force change was to create a crisis so large that it could not be ignored or covered up. "No killing," Fletcher said finally. "We do this at night when the mines are empty. We target equipment, structures, but no workers. We are not murderers." The sisters nodded. They had already crossed many lines, but they had never deliberately taken a life, except in mercy. That line, at least, they would not cross. They spent March 15th preparing. The sisters knew explosives. Their father had taught them decades ago about blasting techniques used in mining. They had the materials, compounds they had collected over the years from abandoned mine operations, stored carefully in the cave. Fletcher telegraphed Dr. Ashworth, telling him to delay his trip, that the situation had changed, that there was danger. He did not explain further, knowing the telegraph operator might share the message with company men. And that night, under a moonless sky, they acted. Fletcher and the Vance sisters moved through the darkness like ghosts, their eyes adjusted to dim light, seeing paths through the forest that others would miss. They reached the main consolidated Kentucky mining operation just after midnight. The property was vast, with multiple buildings, equipment yards, processing facilities. They worked quickly and carefully, placing charges in strategic locations. Prudence handled the technical aspects, her hands steady despite the tremors, her mind sharp despite the poisoning. Patience kept watch, those penetrating eyes scanning for guards, for any sign they had been detected. Fletcher carried supplies, following instructions, pushing down the voice in his head that screamed this was wrong, this was illegal, this would destroy him. At 2 in the morning they were ready. They had checked and rechecked that no workers were in the buildings, that the night watchman was making his rounds far from the blast zone. They had set the fuses to give them time to reach safety. Prudence lit the first fuse. "For our father," she whispered. "For all the men who died because profit mattered more than human life." They ran then, moving as fast as they could through the forest, putting distance between themselves and the coming explosions. The first blast lit up the night sky at 2:17 in the morning. Then the second. Then a cascade of explosions as charges detonated in sequence, destroying equipment, collapsing processing facilities, sending flames shooting into the darkness. The sound rolled through the mountains like thunder, waking people for miles around. Fletcher, Prudence, and Patience watched from a ridge half a mile away. The mining complex burned like a beacon, orange flames consuming decades of infrastructure, hundreds of thousands of dollars in damage, operations that would be shut down for months, maybe years. And somewhere in that chaos, in the scramble to respond, in the questions that would inevitably follow, the truth would have to come out. Federal investigators would come. Journalists would ask questions. The company could no longer simply bury the contamination issue when their entire Perry County operation was literally burning to the ground. "It is done," Prudence said quietly, those penetrating eyes reflecting the distant flames. "For better or worse, we have forced their hand." They returned to the cabin as dawn broke. Fletcher's mind was numb, unable to fully process what they had done. He was now a criminal, a saboteur, someone who had destroyed property worth more than he would earn in 10 lifetimes. His medical career was over. His reputation was destroyed. He could never return to the life he had known. But he had also struck a blow against a corporation that murdered its workers with calculated indifference. He had forced attention onto a crisis that had been ignored for 30 years. He had chosen sides in a war between power and justice, and there was no going back. The response came faster than they expected. By noon, the mountains were crawling with men. Company security, county sheriff's deputies, state investigators summoned from Frankfurt. The scale of the destruction had made this impossible to handle quietly. Too much damage, too much fire, too many witnesses who had seen the explosions. Fletcher stayed at the cabin with the sisters, all of them knowing that arrest was inevitable, simply waiting to see how long they had before the authorities found them. They used the time to hide the most crucial evidence deeper in the cave system, sealing it behind false walls, marking the locations so that someday someone might recover it. And they cared for the 3 men in the underground chamber, feeding them, cleaning them, speaking softly to them, even though none of them could truly understand. If these were to be the last hours of freedom, they would spend them doing what they had always done, trying to preserve life, even when that life had lost all meaning. Sheriff Collier came for them on March 17th, 2 days after the explosions. He rode up to the cabin alone, without deputies, without company men. He looked exhausted, aged 10 years in 2 days. "I know it was you," he said without preamble, standing in the clearing, making no move to approach the cabin. "The company knows it was you. They have descriptions from a night watchman who saw 3 figures near the complex before the fires started. They are demanding arrests, prosecution, the full weight of the law." "Will you arrest us?" Fletcher asked from the porch, the Vance sisters standing silent beside him. Collier was quiet for a long moment. "I should. I am sworn to uphold the law. But I also know why you did it. I know about the contamination, about the poisoning. I've known for years, just like Tucker before me. And I have done nothing because I was afraid, because I had a family to feed, because fighting the company seemed impossible." "So what happens now?" Prudence asked. "Now I make a choice," Collier said. "The same choice Tucker made, the same choice everyone in these mountains has to make eventually. Do I look away or do I stand up?" He pulled out his badge and looked at it, the morning sunlight glinting off the metal. Then he unpinned it and put it in his pocket. "I'm riding back to Hazard right now," he said. "I am going to tell the company men that I rode up here and found the cabin abandoned, that you must have fled during the night. That will buy you maybe 24 hours before they send their own men to search. Use that time, get those 3 men from the cave, get somewhere safe, and get your evidence to someone who will publish it." "You are throwing away your life for us," Fletcher said. "No," Collier replied. "I'm trying to save whatever is left of my soul. Tucker died with regret eating him from the inside. I will not end the same way." He turned his horse and rode away without another word, leaving them standing there in stunned silence. They moved immediately. There was no time for sentiment, no time for second thoughts. Fletcher and the sisters carried the 3 catatonic men up from the underground chamber, a difficult and exhausting process that took hours. They loaded them into a wagon Fletcher had hidden in the woods, covering them with blankets, making them as comfortable as possible for the journey ahead. They packed everything essential: medical supplies, documents, money the sisters had saved over decades. They took one last look at the cabin that had been the Vance family home for over 50 years, knowing they would never return. And then they left, 3 fugitives and 3 broken men, heading west through mountain trails that only the sisters knew, paths that had not been used in years, routes that would take them eventually to West Virginia and temporary safety. The journey took 8 days. They traveled mostly at night, hiding during the day, avoiding settlements and main roads. The 3 patients suffered terribly from the constant movement, becoming agitated, sometimes crying out in their broken voices. Fletcher and the sisters took turns caring for them, feeding them, cleaning them, administering the herbs that kept them calm. Prudence and patience deteriorated rapidly under the stress. Their tremors worsened. Their periods of confusion became longer. One night, Fletcher woke to find Patience wandering in circles in the forest, those penetrating eyes blank and empty, lost in some mental labyrinth the poisoning had created. It took him and Prudence 20 minutes to calm her, to bring her back to awareness. They were all dying, Fletcher realized. The sisters from the years of contamination exposure, the 3 men from the irreversible brain damage, and Fletcher himself from the stress and exhaustion and the weight of what he had become. They were a caravan of the doomed, fleeing toward a destination that might not even exist. On the 8th day, they reached the abandoned property in West Virginia that Patience had remembered. It was a small farmhouse, empty for decades, slowly being reclaimed by the forest. But the structure was sound enough, the well still produced water, and most importantly, it was so remote that no one would find them unless they knew exactly where to look. They settled in, creating makeshift beds for the 3 patients, establishing routines for their care. And Fletcher wrote. He wrote everything. Every detail of what had happened in Perry County. Every piece of evidence they had gathered. Every crime the company had committed. He wrote for 8 hours a day, producing a manuscript that eventually reached 200 pages. When he was finished, he made 3 copies. One he sent to Dr. Ashworth in Pennsylvania. One he sent to a journalist at the New York Times, whose name Ashworth had provided. One he kept hidden in the farmhouse, sealed in a metal box buried under the floor. And then they waited. The response came in May of 1904. Newspapers across the country began publishing the story. Kentucky Mining Company accused of systematic worker poisoning. Decades of contamination covered up by corporate interests. Heroic physician and mountain healers expose industrial murder. The articles were sensational, detailed, and most importantly, widely read. Public outrage grew. Federal investigators descended on Perry County. State legislators called for hearings. Consolidated Kentucky Mining's stock price collapsed. The company executives denied everything, but the evidence was overwhelming, and the public was no longer willing to accept corporate denials at face value. By July, the company had filed for bankruptcy, its reputation destroyed, its operations shut down permanently. The contaminated mine shafts were sealed. The water sources were tested, and some were declared unsafe for human use. Compensation funds were established for workers and families affected by the poisoning. Justice of a sort had been achieved, but the cost had been devastating. Sheriff Raymond Collier was arrested for aiding fugitives and obstructing justice. He served 2 years in prison before dying of a heart attack 6 months after his release. Thomas Brennan was posthumously acknowledged as a whistleblower, though his family received no compensation, no recognition beyond a brief mention in newspaper articles. And the fugitives remained fugitives. Fletcher, Prudence, and Patience could never return to Kentucky without facing criminal charges for the mining complex sabotage. They were wanted criminals, regardless of how justified their actions might have been. The law made no exceptions for righteous destruction of property. They lived in that West Virginia farmhouse for 2 more years, caring for the 3 men, watching the sisters slowly deteriorate. Prudence died in January of 1906, her body finally succumbing to years of metal poisoning. She died peacefully in her sleep, those penetrating gray eyes finally closing for the last time, released at last from the burden of terrible knowledge and impossible choices. Patience followed her sister 4 months later. Without Prudence, she seemed to simply let go, as if half of her had already died and was just waiting for permission to follow. Fletcher held her hand as she passed, and in those final moments, her eyes cleared, the confusion and tremors fading, and she looked at him with perfect clarity. "We did the right thing," she whispered. "Whatever we became, whatever lines we crossed, we tried to save people. That has to count for something." "It counts for everything," Fletcher told her, and he meant it. After Patience died, Fletcher was alone with the 3 men. He cared for them for another year, but it was clear he could not maintain this indefinitely. He was deteriorating too, not from poisoning, but from exhaustion, from isolation, from the weight of responsibility. He made arrangements with a Catholic hospital in Charleston, providing them with a substantial donation from money the sisters had hidden over the years. The hospital agreed to take the 3 men as charity cases, to care for them for the rest of their lives in a secure ward where they would be safe and comfortable. Fletcher delivered them in the fall of 1907, 34 years old, but feeling ancient, worn down to nothing by 3 years of hell. He watched the nurses settle the men into their beds, and he felt something in his chest finally release. He had kept his promise. He had cared for them. They would be safe now. He never practiced medicine again. He changed his name, moved to a small town in Ohio, worked as a bookkeeper for a lumber company. He lived quietly, anonymously, never speaking of what had happened in Kentucky, never revealing his true identity. He married late in life, had no children, and died in 1942 at the age of 69. Among his possessions, his wife found a metal box containing newspaper clippings about the Consolidated Kentucky mining scandal, a journal filled with medical notes about treating metal poisoning, and a photograph. It showed two elderly women standing in front of a mountain cabin, their faces weathered and lined, their gray hair long and wild. But it was their eyes that dominated the photograph. Pale gray, intense, penetrating. Eyes that seemed to look through the camera, through time itself, carrying knowledge that was both terrible and sacred. On the back of the photograph, in handwriting his wife did not recognize, was written, "Prudence and Patience Vance, healers, heroes, murderers, saints." I still do not know which word fits best. Perhaps all of them, perhaps none. The three men who had been kept alive in the cave remained at the Catholic hospital for the rest of their lives. The man who had been there 15 years when Fletcher found him lived another 23 years, dying at the approximate age of 64 in 1930. His mind never recovered. He spent 38 years trapped in a body without a functional consciousness, preserved by compassion that became indistinguishable from cruelty. The other two men lived shorter lives, dying in 1922 and 1926, respectively. None of them ever regained awareness. None of them ever knew they had been saved, or what the cost of that salvation had been. The cave on Blackberry Ridge remains there to this day, though its entrance has long since been concealed by rock slides and vegetation. The belongings of 43 men are still hidden in those dark chambers, artifacts of lives cut short by corporate greed and systemic indifference. The personal effects that were labeled so carefully by women who wanted to remember every single victim they could not save. Sometimes locals report seeing lights moving through the forest on Blackberry Ridge at night. They say if you go to investigate, you will find nothing but emptiness. But you will feel watched. You will feel penetrating eyes on you, even though no one is there. Eyes that see too much, that carry the weight of impossible choices, that judge not with condemnation, but with terrible understanding. The land where the mining complex once stood is now an environmental cleanup site, still being decontaminated over a century later. The water sources that were poisoned in the 1870s remain unsafe. The full extent of the contamination was worse than even the Vance sisters knew, spreading farther, lasting longer, affecting more people than anyone could have imagined. Some people in Perry County still speak of Prudence and Patience Vance, though most of the stories are confused now, mixed with legend and superstition. Some call them witches who cursed the mining company. Some call them angels who sacrificed everything to protect the mountains. Some call them criminals who destroyed jobs and livelihoods with their sabotage. All of them are partially right, and all of them are missing the larger truth. The Vance sisters were ordinary women placed in an extraordinary situation. They watched their father be murdered for telling the truth. They saw their community being slowly poisoned while authorities looked away. They tried to save people using the only tools they had: their knowledge, their isolation, their willingness to cross lines that others would not cross. And in trying to save people, they created a different kind of horror. Men kept alive but not truly living. Justice achieved through terrorism. Healing that could not be distinguished from torture. They became everything they fought against, not through malice, but through the corruption that comes from fighting impossible battles with insufficient weapons. Their penetrating eyes, damaged by the same poisons they tried to cure, saw the truth that most of us avoid. That sometimes there are no good choices. That sometimes you can do everything right and still fail. That sometimes the cost of fighting evil is becoming something evil yourself. And that knowledge, that terrible clarity, is the heaviest burden anyone can carry. If you made it this far, you are exactly the kind of person Appalachian Shadows exists for. Someone who does not turn away from complexity. Someone who wants to understand the truth buried in these mountains, even when that truth is uncomfortable, even when it challenges simple narratives about heroes and villains. Next week, I'm bringing you the story of the Harlan County Revival of 1891, where an entire congregation vanished during a 3-day religious service. and the only evidence left behind was a single page from a Bible with one verse circled in blood. And that case, it makes this one look straightforward. Subscribe to Appalachian Shadows now and turn on notifications, because these stories from the hollows and ridges do not stay buried forever. Someone has to remember. Someone has to tell the truth even when it hurts. One more thing. I know many of you watching are from Kentucky, Tennessee, West Virginia, the Carolinas, Appalachian country. If your family has stories like this, cases that were hushed up, disappearances that were never solved, secrets that were buried in the hollows, poisonings that were blamed on natural causes, companies that put profit over lives, share them in the comments. You do not have to use names, just the story, because I read every single comment, and your stories might become the next investigation here on Appalachian Shadows. The mountains remember everything, even when we try to forget.